All right, folks, why don't we get started? Welcome to everybody for joining. My name's Eve Mailer. I'm going to be, I guess, kind of the MC and one of the presenters for today's webinar on Access Management 2.0, UMA for the Enterprise. Just wanted to introduce myself a bit and also my co-presenter, Thomas Harjono. I am the kind of the founder and currently the chair of the Kantara Initiative User-Managed Access Group. By the way, that's my role by night. By day, I'm a forester analyst. Thomas, why don't you say a few words to introduce yourself as well?
Sure. My name is Thomas Harjono. I am the Executive Director of the MIT Kerberos and Internet Trust Consortium at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I've been a spec editor with Eve for at least the last couple of years on the UMA specifications.
And I think he's a bit under the weather, so thanks, Thomas, for joining us today. So a couple of just initial items here. So first of all, we'd love to get your tweets. You can engage with us at the UMA WG handle on Twitter, and if you want to pose questions, you can either put them in the chat window, or you can also use the UMA AM20 hashtag. We will be putting the recording up from this webinar eventually, hopefully not too long from now, but you can actually get a copy of the slides there now. So do take a look at those if you like. So here's what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to start with the realities and challenges of modern access control, and I'm going to turn things over to co-speaker Scott Morrison on that topic. And then Thomas and I will review some basics about UMA as they apply to enterprise use cases. And then we'll hear from Mike Schwartz of GLUE with a case study and some demos. And we'll have some other folks chime in, hopefully one or more depending on connectivity, about other software vendors who are looking at UMA, implementing UMA, and we'll finish with a formal Q&A session. If we do see things in the chat or on Twitter that pop up earlier, we can try and attend to them. So I do want to just have a shout out to CA, which has graciously sponsored our putting on this webinar today, and I just want to offer personal thanks to Alex Jones, who's been helping us with all of the logistics. Really appreciate it. Also, thanks to Kantara Initiative for supporting the work that we do at UMA. This is where the work group does its work. I also want to just say thanks to all the humanitarians, as those of us involved in working on UMA call ourselves, for their continued support. And then finally, thanks to the other folks who have been helping us create this webinar and are, in a lot of cases, working on implementations and thinking about these important access management questions. So I want to turn things over to Scott Morrison of CA, formerly of Layer 7, to talk a little bit about the realities and challenges that we see.
Hey, thanks a lot, Eve. Listen, it's great to speak to everybody today. So, as Eve mentioned, I'm the old CTO of Layer 7 Technology. So, I've been deeply involved in all of the issues and problems around identity as it relates to APIs and web services for a lot of years. And this is an area that's really interested us for a while. And I think, the work that Kantara and Eve in particular has really spearheaded within the community, around this new approach to identity is tremendously important. So as I mentioned, have been doing, lots of work looking at problems of identity in the enterprise. And the enterprise is still really doing things the same way for the most part. Identity is, based in a silo, somewhere hidden deep behind the firewalls. And typically, it's managed by this cabal of identity, access control engineers and people who really know how to run all these complex and difficult systems in the enterprise. But things are changing. There's kind of cracks in that, that wall that I think we've had for a long time. Because that wall's been about centralized control. I mean, that whole thing has been about keeping all of the power in the hands of just really a few people. And I think it began really with OAuth, which the genius of OAuth was really this idea that we could begin to delegate out control and decisions not to these few people who, ran the directories and ran the IAM systems, but out to the people themselves, the people who actually own the identities. And I think that's a really, really profound idea. So if anybody comes to you and says, OAuth, it's just yet another security token like a Kerberos or yet another SAML or something like that, I got to tell you that couldn't be more wrong, because OAuth really did lead the way in this direction. And taken to its logical conclusion, this is where you end up really with UMA. And this is why I'm so excited about this technology. I really think it solves that fundamental problem of putting control into the hands of people who own identities. And that's the reason that at Layer 7 we were interested in it, and that's the reason at CA we're very interested in supporting this as well. So back to you, Eve.
Wonderful. Thanks for your commentary. I love that you talk about sort of what I think of as the jaw drop factor of OAuth and how important it really is. There's definitely shifts coming. So with that, we'll talk a little 101 for the enterprise. We actually have a slide deck that we call UMA 101, which is just kind of UMA basics in general. And this has a bit more of the bent of why you'd want to do this for access management in the enterprise. So let's start by looking for a moment at OAuth. And I'm not going to assume that everybody who's joined us today knows OAuth inside and out. So I want to just describe a little bit. This is the first diagram that you see if you go to the OAuth standard, which is, IETF RFC 6749. And I've described it here with one particular elevator pitch. You could actually use several different elevator pitches because OAuth can do a whole bunch of different things. But one way to see it is it's a 3-entity protocol for securing API calls in a user context. So I've highlighted the 3 entities that I mean that are so key. The authorization server, often just called an AS, a resource server, RS, that has protected resources, and a client application. And so the resource owner was originally assumed to be a human being, and quite often is a human being. And quite often the way that the resource owner engages in OAuth flows is that if you have, let's say, a third-party Twitter tool like Tweetbot and you want to connect it to your Twitter API to make calls on your behalf, you get redirected to Twitter to log into your Twitter account and consent to the issuance of an access token that Tweetbot can then use. So that access token is really key because you don't have to share your real credentials with Tweetbot, and that access token is just for Tweetbot to use, the other third-party app connecting to your Twitter account. And it may have limited power and scope to do things at that API. So those are all really key, and that for me is the jaw drop factor right there. Now, typically you have an authorization server that does access token issuance through, well, for more than one resource server, but they're typically assumed to be in the same domain or have some other tight coupling of their trust relationship. And you'll notice there's no arrows that go back and forth between the authorization server and the resource server because they do some communication, but it's typically in a proprietary way. We don't have visibility into that through the standard. So that's kind of how OAuth basically works, really quickly in a nutshell. And I wanted to use that to build on the UMA picture. We call this the marvelous spiral of UMA. It was designed by our wonderful graphics editor, Domenico Catalano, over at Oracle. So UMA's original goal was to take OAuth-based data sharing and really put some injection of privacy by design into it. And you'll see these further reading badges. Those are tiny URLs that you can go to read more about these subjects. You can see those if you download the slides as well. So you're seeing a lot of similarities between the OAuth 3 entities and the UMA entities. We've got a resource owner, we've got an authorization server, we've got a resource server, we've got a client, and then we have some additional pieces here. So let's just talk about these for a bit. To start, we call that lady Alice. She is the user in user-managed access. That is to say, we're trying to arrange for sensible, meaningful privacy controls over what Alice wants shared or doesn't want shared with others in the universe. That is her data. So we talk a lot about sharing by Alice to various parties. Now, the resource server, which might contain any kind of data, any kind of content, present any kind of APIs, just like in plain OAuth. The resource server has the opportunity to outsource protection to a centralized, what we think of as a digital footprint control console, meaning that that centralized console, the AS, may be in a different domain from the resource server. So we basically had to, as I like to think of it, go there and define interfaces between the RS and AS to fully flesh out the picture of how you loosely couple them and how you have a security model between them. And so the authorization server, to achieve this, standardizes a couple of APIs for interacting with the other entities in this picture for privacy and what we think of as selective sharing, which is sort of a positive view of what privacy means in digitized content. And then finally, just one note about this guy here. Because OAuth assumed that Alice would be sort of on both ends of the access token issuance connection, OAuth itself has not really formally accounted for what if Alice wants to share with Bob, somebody with completely different credentials, somebody who's an autonomous third party. So the UMA model actually solves for that. Now, our original goal was literally Alice to Bob sharing, and Alice, sharing by individuals with individuals and organizations. What's really interesting is what it turns out we seem to have come up with. And I apologize for the headline looking a little horsey here. Variations in fonts got the better of us. So what we discovered by solving that problem, we started to have a model that looks an awful lot like a classic access management architectural model. What you see on the left is sort of the official XACML architecture model. And I've got a link there if you want to sort of read more about XACML. So it's really quite interesting that what enterprises need to do in terms of separation of various jobs and duties of different architectural components, we ended up sort of having something like that. So I wanted to just walk through this a little bit to show what I mean. So for starters, a policy administration point is what the authorization server presents to Alice, but the resource owner doesn't have to be a human being. It could be an organization, a corporation, for example. So that's one sort of similarity there. In UMA, what we've done to standardize the flows here, just assume a whole bunch of stuff is sort of buried behind the authorization server, and there's maybe more standardization akin to that we've seen from OAuth and UMA coming along these lines. So we'll just talk about the authorization server as a place the resource owner goes to administer policy. And we do have, applications that have been developed to do exactly that, and you'll see demos of that today. The next similarity or analogy we see is that there's a policy enforcement point, a PEP, that is approximately what the resource server role serves in UMA. So I like to say it's a little bit softened. There's where the resource server is a PEP and the authorization server is a policy decision point. Is that a hard line in UMA? Actually, it turns out not to be that hard a line, in that by virtue of profiling the token that passes between them, you can actually implement a lot of different models for responsibility of who is actually doing all the policy decision making. So it's an interesting sort of extensibility point. By default, though, in UMA, the authorization server is call it a 90% PDP, where the resource server actually has some responsibilities. We've been talking with folks in the Cloud Authorization Technical Committee at Oasis about the model they've been innovating, an enforcement model versus a modern entitlements model, and I think that UMA lives up to that entitlements model. A policy information point, where do the policies come from? Well, the authorization server either could, the application that functions as an UMA compliant authorization server, could be natively storing policies in whatever format, and or could be a client of offboard sources. Interestingly, so we haven't gone into XACML territory at all in terms of saying the policy language has to be XACML or has to be something else. It's actually flexible because it's not exposed to the UMA protocol. And then finally, where do we find out enough about Bob and any other requesting parties in order to assess the suitability of their access request. And we have a number of models and a number of flows for enabling that. And the key takeaway, I think, from that is that UMA and XACML can coexist nicely in terms of if you have policies that are in XACML form, UMA can be sort of a nice front end for handling the application of those policies to access requests. All right, just a little bit more about sort of what's going on under the covers with UMA. So we have three main entities. So we have three different pairwise relationships between them. So I want to describe those really briefly to you all. The first one is the resource server exposes whatever API it wants, whatever set of resources it wants, just like in plain OAuth, and those resources are protected by an AS, just like in plain OAuth. The token that you see here that is presented by a client to try and get access to the resources at that server, we call a requesting party token. So you can think of that as analogous to the access token in OAuth, but it actually has some properties that make it more flexible. For example, it can be based on claims sourced from the requesting party, not just authentication of Alice, the resource owner. The second of the three pairwise relationships is that the AS has to interact with the resource server across the internet, potentially, because they might be run by different companies. And to do that, the authorization server exposes what we call a protection API. And that includes the ability for the resource server to inform the authorization server of what resources need protecting and what sort of scopes are applicable over them. So if you know OAuth well and you know of the tussles we've been through with standardizing scopes and how they're not standardized, UMA presents the start of a way to actually make them interoperable, even if they're still proprietary scopes and completely specific to your implementation. To secure that API, we use, not surprisingly, a protection API token. It's just an OAuth protected API. So there's embedded OAuth within UMA flows. And then the final pairwise connection among these three entities is what interface the authorization server presents to clients. And you won't be surprised to hear that it's called an authorization API, and it's protected by vanilla OAuth, once again, with what we call an authorization API token. That's why we give them names, because we have three tokens flowing around here. We have a number of interesting flows for gathering claims with the help of the client so that we understand the client and requesting party better in order to assess suitability for access. And so just the one takeaway that I will give you here is that if the client is in possession of, let's say, a SAML token or OpenID Connect claims or an ID token, those are things that we can leverage that the AS can actually consume from the client in order to avoid having to redirect poor Bob over to now do something at the AS to provide claims. So these are ways in which UMA is kind of trying to be a full partner in the ecosystem of identity and access standards that we have here. So I want to turn things over to Thomas to talk a little bit about the key use cases that have arisen.
Sure. Thank you, Eve. And folks, my apologies if I don't sound too good. I'm got the flu today, so yeah, bear with me. So at MIT, we basically have three families of use cases. The first one, which is kind of captured in that diagram, is a use case that is part of an effort called the Big Data at CSAIL initiative. And if you just Google Big Data at CSAIL, you will see a huge big data project that has many corporate sponsors and members, part of the Computer Science and AI Lab at MIT. A sub-project within that initiative is the creation of what they call a living lab at MIT. And what they want to do is basically allow students, faculty, and basically anyone in the community of MIT to collect data about themselves as part of this quantified self movement. So in the diagram, you see a student carrying what is called a PDF client, personal data store client. If you go to the iTunes store, you can download a freebie version of the MIT app, which has all sorts of interesting things about MIT. But an extension to that app will be this PBS client, and it would allow the students or staff to opt in to collect data about themselves, things like, GPS movements and so on. And that data would then be captured within an MIT personal data service. So every person basically would have a personal data store. And that data store will then be accessible, subject to the owner's authorization, of course, to organizations within MIT, which is line 3 there in the diagram, or to Bob in line 4, which is Alice's friend in this case. And so we have an implementation of OpenID Connect at MIT, which is called a MITRE ID Connect, which is a donation from MITRE Corporation, which MIT now owns and is growing. And we're using that for identity management and SSO. But this year we hope to be looking into deploying at least an early version of UMA to do the specific sharing of items for Bob, it's a Bob and Alice relationship. The second use case is basically related to the first, which is academic transcript. So, here's a graduating student, and he wants to allow headhunters, outside companies and so on, to get access to his or her academic transcript, for 6 weeks, for example. And we'd like to allow that to happen so that, with a single right click, on the mouse, you can allow these external entities to get access to specific items that is authorized by the user. The third one is an interesting one. So if you go to the MIT Medical website at the moment, it allows the patient there to share some of the medical records with external entities. But the interesting thing on that site is that the MIT community member, i.e. the student or faculty, actually has to do an SSO out of MIT. So they're prompted with a Google, Facebook, login page, and then they come back again to the MIT site. And so we think that's kind of the opposite of what should happen. I think, the students and staff need to log on to an MIT authorization infrastructure first before they go out to services outside MIT. Related to this is an effort we're doing in the area of Blue Button Plus. So for those who are in the medical, healthcare space, you probably know about Blue Button Plus. We are definitely interested in that, and we will be having a workshop at the end of next week, March 28th, at MIT. It's a free workshop where we will discuss some of the issues about patient data sharing and about deployment of Blue Button Plus for these medical use cases. And in there will be a lot of discussion about UMA and how UMA can actually work very well in the area of healthcare and patient data sharing. If you go to the website, kit.mit.edu, you will see a link to that workshop, and you can also download an agenda item. Eve.
Awesome. So we're now at the key use case that we're mostly here to talk about today, which is Enterprise Access Management 2.0. And I just want to do some quick comparisons of how you might think of sort of web access management as it has been done to date and the opportunity that we have with UMA. So we know that web access management has been complex and feature-rich. There's a lot of things that you can do with WAM solutions. They tend to reside in the proprietary world if you're going beyond something like plain, say, SAML-based web SSO. Then you're generally in the land of, well, it's pretty tightly coupled to what we're doing, so we're just going to stay proprietary. And because it's been really, truly web access management, there are elements of it that tend to be mobile and API unfriendly, like assuming that you've got a web form for a certain kind of primary authentication, for example. You tend to have a more brittle deployment architecture that assumes that you've deployed an agent in the enterprise or something similar. I just mentioned not agnostic to authentication method. It's hard to source distributed policies. I think we've seen a lot of innovation from Example on that, but there are certain ways in which I think organizations find it's tough to scale. And oftentimes you stick with really coarse-grained access because that's what the tools are just best able to handle. And so the opportunity that we have with UMA is RESTful APIs that give you access controls that provide a simpler baseline of standardized functionality. So it's not to necessarily say it's 100% of a solution you'd ever need, but in a world where we often find that our next partner is in a domain different from us, we work with SaaS applications and SaaS APIs. Scott was pointing out how this is 21st century. This is how we do things now. We need to be prepared for these models. It turns out that handling authorization functionality can be done just like we do with a lot of other things. You call an endpoint. You get provisioned with the endpoint, and you can go to it, and you don't necessarily have to put in place an architecture that's very disruptive. Just like OAuth, UMA is agnostic as to authentication method and whether you've got federated authentication happening, which is great. It does not dictate a particular policy expression language. It does not dictate the source of where those policies reside and are evaluated. And one of the things that I think is really underexplored to date, and UMA gives us an opportunity to do, is we've seen a lot of innovation around API design best practices. I think we're about to see some OAuth-type scope design best practices. So whatever the scope is that you've designed into your API, you have the opportunity with UMA to not only leverage that scope in assessing access requests, but make those scopes more interoperable and shareable. So with that, I'm going to let Mike display his screen and share information and a live demo with you.
Okay, hi everyone. This is Mike Schwartz. I'm the founder, CEO of Glue. And thank you, Eve and Thomas and CA for sponsoring this call. And I'm going to share my desktop. And you know, when I first started looking at the UMA stuff, it was sort of intimidating. And so I think that what I'd like to do is show just an example of how we implemented it. And sometimes seeing how it works will make all the jargon make more sense. Because it is there's a lot of new entities and jargon. So let me just show it. And so over the years I've used a number of access management platforms like SiteMinder and ForgeRock and Oracle, etc. And so I guess I always compare. Maybe I should start with just showing like what's the same about those platforms or similarities. And then we could talk about some differences. But when I think about, let's just take SiteMinder, for example. And SiteMinder, part of it is you have to define the rules for access management. So what are the APIs that we're protecting? What are the URLs? And then the other part of it is we need to express the policy, what people or clients, network, time of day, you know, other information that I can pull from the context, can I use in my policy to figure out if this access request should be granted. So I always break it into those two parts. So first I wanted to show the rules part. How do we just say what are the things that we're protecting? And I'll show this first in the interface, which is really probably not the way programmers will do it. They'll the second way I'll show is the Apache plugin. But it'll show you the same thing sort of in two different ways. But I think it's easier to start with this. So let's say, okay, I have a URL that I want to protect, and we'll just call this protected site. You can provide the site can provide an icon, and now I'm going to add some APIs. So these could be example.com/protected/star. So anything in this folder. Or it could be a specific API, example.com, API v1, add person. So in UMA, this is called the resource set. All right, so I just gave this resource set a name. I gave it the URL of an icon. and I started to define, for example, here I defined example.com/protected/star, and here I defined add person, an API. I could add another API / delete person. Okay, so now I want to control access to these to this resource set, and there's a very manual way we could do it. We could just specify clients specifically, but I don't really like that approach because it's tightly bundled, and for the same reason I don't like to put IP addresses into policies either. So UMA provides another flexible way that you can control access, and they're called UMA scopes. So if I add a scope, let me just I'll add the view scope and the my token scope, and oops, I am happens if I hit enter. Let me try it again. I've done this demo a million times, but I've never done it on this particular screen.
You forgot to light a candle to the demo gods.
Yeah, okay. I proved it on my bigger screen. But what this says is that before the authorization server gives access to one of these resources, it needs to evaluate all of the policies associated with the view scope and all of the policies associated with the my token scope. So it provides a mapping between the policies and the resources. So okay, so how do we define policies? Now this is where Eve pointed out that UMA doesn't tell you how to express the policies. It's policy expression neutral. So in our case, in the Glue server, we let you use Python to so you have to implement an interface and return true or false for authorized. So but you could have XACML here. Here you could gather your information and make a XACML request to a server and get a response and then authorize based on that. Notice also that there's the view scope. So we only have to write the policy once. We can use this policy for multiple scopes. Okay, so this is sort of one direction. Let me show the other direction, which is the Apache agent. Okay, and so in SiteMinder and many access management systems today, it's a common approach to use the web server as the policy enforcement point. And I think that UMA as an OAuth 2 profile, it provides a much easier integration mechanism for native applications that want to call the APIs directly. And it does it in a standard way. So while SiteMinder and Oracle have their own authorization API, UMA says, in a way, we could use OAuth 2 for this, and let's agree on a standard way to a standard protocol. But the web filter approach is still a really good approach. This is widely used by enterprises because it doesn't require that the programmer be involved. The system administrator can really handle to make sure that this folder is protected. And from Apache, you can proxy and you can connect, or from another web container like Nginx or Tomcat. So this approach is a good one. How do we actually specify? So note in UMA, there is the capability to dynamically register, as Eve pointed out. The resource server, in this case the Apache server, says what resources do I have. In this case, that would be the URL/UMA, and also it can say, so here's the authorization server. In order to get access to this folder, you need to ask this authorization server for authorization for these scopes. So, and Glue's convention is to use URLs for scopes. And that way, if you have a scope like view, you can make sure that it doesn't collide with maybe your partner's view scope. So that's sort of our recommendation, is to follow. SAML has a parameter called ACR, so which also uses URIs. But in this, what's interesting about UMA is that, as Eve mentioned, some of the platforms like SiteMinder and Oracle have a lot of features over the years. But one thing that I think that UMA has that's sort of new is that it supports this idea of federation, where in most SiteMinder or Oracle, there's one policy server for the domain. But I think UMA supports the idea that perhaps there could be multiple domains that have policies that should determine whether a person or a client should be granted access. So maybe you have in the Army, you have the Department of Defense as a policy. There's a policy at the hospital that says you must be a doctor. So I think that the idea that we're sort of recognizing that the authorization server is a server on the internet that we're going to talk to in a standard way. It leaves more opportunities open for collaboration in authorization. So I guess that's it. Eve, that sound good for today?
Yeah, so if anybody has questions about the particulars of this, certainly put them in the chat or send them to us on Twitter, and we can discuss them. Let me just make sure that I can get control back here. Excellent. So, so now I thought that what we could do is just talk about, so you've just heard from Mike, who's representing GLUE, and we do have some other folks who are planning to participate in the interop activities that we're just about to begin. We've been developing feature tests, a la the feature tests that underlie, a lot of the OpenID Connect types of interops. And we do have one set of folks present here today that have prepared some materials to talk about their involvement. And so I think that Maciej Mikulak, who is the CEO of Cloud Identity Limited, he was unable to connect. What I'm going to do is just run through these really quickly to give you a sense. I did consult with Maciej this morning, so I'll just sort of speak under his control. Just a word about the participation of Cloud Identity. Maciej is actually the vice chair of the UMA work group, and his group has been the first actually to implement UMA, which is kind of fun, starting with use cases that surround personal data stores and personal data services, but also include enterprise use cases now. So I apologize, I don't know if it's noob or newbie AM, but this authorization manager product is an UMA compliant AS, and it involves quite a lot of the standards that we've been talking about. So just a little bit more detail here. These are part of the slides that you can download, so I'm going to just go very briefly through them. But you can see that there's, sourcing back to originally stored identity and applying an access control layer here. Just a little bit more detail. So enterprise use cases include, I think you're seeing a similar use case, a similar scenario to what we just saw from Mike and what they're doing with GLUE. And he also provided a couple of, I think, very cool screenshots. So what you're seeing here is actually looking at an audit trail of what access choices were made and what access was made. So the example here is of health data. So you can imagine that this could be a patient-centric health data use case, or it could be a sort of business use case. And those who have looked at the sample apps that we have created a demo video out of will find this interface familiar, because if the resource owner is Alice, whether it's patient Alice or consumer, or whether it's a company, it can work the same. And it's one of the things I actually think, harking back to what Scott was saying about sort of 21st century and how we have to do this, making it possible for people and organizations to kind of be peers in terms of how they get access control capability is kind of exciting. And the last screen here, just make one more comment here that the settings for how you onboard authorization partners are shown here. And so if you think of what you have to do in identity federation, you have to onboard IDPs and RPs. And so what we're talking about here is a similar process for onboarding partners potentially in the enterprise. So I want to talk a little bit about next steps that are possible and next steps that are going on right now. We actually invite anybody who's interested in any of these use cases, in any of this technology, in Access Management 2.0 for the new century that we're a couple decades into now. You can get involved. To become a member of the work group, it's actually free to join. Again, we call ourselves humanitarians, and you can find join links at that tiny URL. Certainly, even if you don't want to join the WG, you can certainly, if you want to, start implementing and take part in our implementation discussions and our interoperability discussions. And there's a separate list called UMA-Dev for that. And that doesn't involve any kind of IP agreement. You could just join. It's basically just a place to talk. So, do feel free to join our UMA-Dev list as well. We mentioned our UMA-WG handle. Pretty active on Twitter. We actually also have a Facebook presence, if that floats your boat. And just so you know what we're working on right now, how far have we taken this? How real is it? Well, the basics are looking pretty well settled, and we're hoping to test those out, with multiple independent implementations shortly. On a technical level, where we're spending most of our time right now includes working on the claim profiling. We call them claim profiles when you arrange to get facts about or preferences from Bob around what he wants you to know, or maybe it's Bobco, maybe it's a company approaching to access a resource, in order to try and get through to the resource. And so, as I mentioned before, these can involve either redirecting Bob over if he's a human being, or if the client is smart enough to happen to have a token lying around for Bob and there's a trust relationship that suffices between the client and the authorization server, it can actually push claim information over to the AS. And it's sort of like, it's a way, if Alice is on both ends of this equation, it's a way to do single sign-on that's entirely claims-based, which is kind of cool. And so we're profiling various kind of other standards that can help with that. So if that floats your boat, that's a reason maybe to get involved. And then on the business level, we know that distributing authorization, to outsourcing authorization to maybe an entirely separate company that runs its own AS. A couple of use cases I can think of is somebody wants to stand up authorization as a service and you contract with them to run an AS, could happen. The reciprocal would be you're a company that runs your own security token service, an AS, and you want the SaaS APIs in your business life to respect all of your authorization decisions. That would be another reason they might reside in a different place. So we have been working on, with Daza Greenwood and with the input of a whole bunch of other legal eagles, something called binding obligations, which is a business layer of description of the responsibilities taken on and the rights of different parties when you have multi-party interactions with these immense consequences. And it points the way to actually a very exciting future where you can attach machine-readable code to terms of authorization. And Daz is just doing awesome work in that area, and so we're tracking that and working on that. It points the way as well to the same as we have access federation trust frameworks. Identity federation trust frameworks, you can start to see what access federation trust frameworks would look like, so that we're starting to apply to the world of authorization what we've done to the world of identification and authentication in terms of portable identity and multi-domain. And we're planning to have a webinar a quarter, and I think that the next webinar in Q2, it's not scheduled yet, but I think we're going to focus on the synergies between UMA and OpenID Connect and the opportunities around personal data store use cases. So I hope you'll keep an eye out for that and join us for that.
Eve, can I add one more use case?
Absolutely.
Well, Scott Morrison, when he did his presentation at RSA a couple of weeks ago, mentioned headless APIs. And headless APIs present a weird challenge for enterprises because, previously the web, in a web browser, we had a connection to the person. But in headless APIs, the client, the mobile application has a connection to the person, and this resource server, as you pointed out in your first slide about OAuth 2, doesn't really have a direct connection to and it presents a new challenge for how are we going to know that the requester is actually authorized? So it's sort of a simple use case that people forget about, but how do you actually secure these headless APIs? And UMA actually provides a very, sort of simple, intuitive solution for that.
Excellent, thanks. Hopefully Scott is still on the call. Do you have anything to add about such topics and use cases that you see?
Not too much, and I am excited about the potential for UMA in exactly that, because it's a surprisingly common use case that we run into, and it's something that we've been, struggling with trying to, manage key material and that effectively in scenarios like that. So stay tuned. It's definitely something we're looking into.
Awesome. So this is a great final chance. If you've got any questions burning in your mind, I'm just going to double check Twitter to see if there's any questions there. And the chat window, yes, some questions. Awesome. So, hey, Bob Pinero, is it a reasonable use case that a resource owner wants to provide access to some specific set of individuals? If so, does the resource owner need to collect identity information about each individual for the claims-based model? What entity generates verified claims associated with those individuals to prevent impersonators from accessing the resource? Great question. So the simplest use case that we set for ourselves when talking about Alice to Bob sharing was, how do we establish that it's Bob at Gmail? So we could set up a policy that looks like a very, pedestrian kind of access control list that just says this list of email addresses can get in to this particular resource set with these particular scopes. That's what a policy might look like. And so we set for ourselves the challenge of, okay, how do we know that the guy who shows up controls Bob at Gmail? And the way it works is there's a couple of different ways. If it's actually, an OpenID Connect-based client, like if the client Bob is using is already, say, an RP and is in possession of good knowledge that it's Bob at Gmail through an ID token and user claims that are OpenID Connect-based, then indeed it's possible for it to inform the AS that, yes, this is Bob's email and it happens to correspond to what you need to know. So give me the right authorization data to associate with my requesting party token. It's the simplest, most obvious kind of policy that you can have. Sometimes I think of, access control lists are like the passwords of authorization. Everybody thinks they're horrible and that they don't scale, but everybody uses them. Kind of perhaps like regexes, as Mike was saying about doing the grain of authorization. So so that is a way
Can I jump in for 1 second?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, there's no right answer for the trust model between the client, let's say the resource server, the client, the resource server, and the authorization server. There's many trust models out there. In some cases, all three of those are tightly controlled by the company. In some cases, the client is an app on the internet. And so, as Eva mentioned, there's a couple of ways that the authorization server can collect the user claims. One is, right, if it's an OpenID Connect, the authorization server can request its own ID token. That's one way. Another way is the client can send the attributes to the authorization server in the HTTP headers, in the request, rather. And in this case, the client would have to be trusted. Although AOL has pointed out, George Fletcher from AOL, that if the client claims are encrypted, the client might not have to be trusted. So there's a number of trust models that can be implemented there. And then another one is SAML. SAML does user claims, and so the authorization server itself could be a SAML SP and can be trusted. So there's no right or wrong way to do it. It depends on the situation and the party.
Yeah, and I encourage folks to sort of look at our core spec, the core UMA spec that calls out to our newish claim profiling spec, where we're working on exactly what flows we can standardize to increase the interop when you know that the trust model supports that kind of, say, forwarding on claims. So we've got a couple other questions. I want to get to as many as possible. The second one was, theoretically, can the AS be part of the RS, or does that just result in the general current situation? That's more geared toward the personal data use case than the enterprise use case. But I'm interested in ideas that allow the AS to be decentralized. Basically, imagine RS services that act as a single identity in a headless API context. So I'll say a couple words and see who else wants to jump in. But one of the recent innovations that we completed in our revision number 9 of our spec, which we recently contributed to IETF as an individual internet draft, which we've been doing periodically, is recognizing that any pair of the 3 key entities may have such a tight trust relationship by virtue of maybe being in the same software component, or they're behind the same firewall and you don't want to go out to HTTP to communicate between them, that we built in a very careful way to selectively opt out for each pair that might have a tight relationship. So OAuth indeed is kind of AS and RS living in the same house. If you've got a proprietary communications pattern between them that you want to take advantage of, we didn't want to make that impossible. And we can think of many use cases for RS and client being perhaps the same web app. Like if Flickr wanted to redo the way it has friends and family ACLs, you know, a way to give a lot more functionality might be to UMA enable the app and have the RS and the client be the same thing.
Or in fact, the SiteMinder agent is an example where the RS and the client are combined.
Yep, great example. Given the topic of our talk today. And so, you know, right on down the line, I guess AS and C is another one we've talked about in terms of some researcher use cases. So we built in a way to kind of declare that, yes, I'm kind of opting out of the loosely coupled way of communicating between those two. And we recommend that if you use that extensibility profile, you write a corresponding extension profile to say exactly how they communicate in case you've got independently implemented components that need to interact on that sort of proprietary basis. So
although that particular mix, AS plus RS, does seem a little weird to me, because if you think of policy decision point, policy enforcement point, the idea of mixing those two together seems a little, I don't know what the exact use case would be, but mostly people want the policy decision point. So.
That's what OAuth, a lot of OAuth implementations do this today. I mean, the token introspection spec of OAuth came about. There's been a couple of proposals for token introspection precisely because a lot of folks run their own AS and run their own RSs, and they might be in a 1-to-100 ratio, and they had to invent a proprietary communications channel between them to introspect the token. So you've got a token that functions like a, you know, it's just an opaque string. So the RS introspects it right at the AS. So we had to solve for that, loosely coupled, so we did, and we actually point to Justin Richard's token introspection draft for that. But hey, if you have your own way of doing it already and you don't want to disrupt it, and it's, you know, behind closed doors, then we provide a way to go for it. Another question came in. Has there been thinking? Yes, certainly.
Just wanted to add to this discussion on AS and coupling with RS. So we see a lot of let's say interest from the personal data store vendors, and how basically the AS could be more coupled, how it could provide more functions, how, you know, there could be a tighter relationship. So it's quite a common use case that we see in the PDS space. For us, it's often means that you know, we can even tailor better the user experience for the individual. We can, you know, even empower the user better. We lose a lot of things, but in many cases, the user experience actually justifies the, you know, such of a coupling between the AS and RS.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think Mike showing that an RS can respect multiple ASs gets kind of interesting in circumstances where we might see a proliferation of different ASs that, poor consumers are sort of forced to use because they don't always have choice about the services. We have time for maybe one more question. I think we're going to run out of time for everything, but I'll try and just sort of go quick. Someone asked, has there been thinking in UMA on more mobile-centered consent flows where a web-style redirect might not be optimal? The thing I would say there is simply that UMA is leveraging OAuth really quite heavily for all of that. So where OAuth provides different styles of clients, UMA can take advantage of them too. Any other comments by our panelists on that one?
Well, I think that's one of the big advantages of UMA, is that it does support mobiles, not just also in a developer-friendly way. I think that one of the lessons learned over the last decade is that developers like JSON REST APIs, and if you give them one of those, they're more likely to use it, and it's in their toolkit. So I think it's mobile-friendly by architecture, but also by just technology stack.
Great comment. Last two questions here. One is, can you speak to UMA activities related to the Internet to Shibboleth solution and with the GTRI, GFI, PM, NEAF directions? Really quickly, we have been, Keith Hazelton is at our table looking at the accessibility attribute sharing, and we think that UMA can be an important part of that breakfast. Don't have time to say more. I don't know if Keith is on the line and wants to jump in. But in general, we think that UMA can be an important component of a lot of cloud authorization and access control use cases, and that runs down to IoT, Internet of Things, and a whole bunch of other things that are top of mind for folks today. Final question before we do have to wrap up. Comment about, love to see UMA be a way to articulate ABAC, meaning NIST, special publication 800-162. We have been providing some input into a lot of the ABAC conversations happening, for example, at the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, for example. And as I mentioned, we've been talking with the Cloud Authorization TC folks. So we'd love that too. So those who are interested.
Can I just say a quick word about that?
Yep, absolutely.
If that's all you want for your policy expressions, then you got it. Because, but in the reality, I think that there's a lot other contextual information, like the network. Is this a request coming from Belarus? Maybe is this, so there's network, there's time of day, there's client credential or client attributes, user attributes. So attribute-based, group-based, there's many considerations you could use to make policies, and attribute-based is a good one for user claims, but it's not. I don't think it's the answer to security on the internet.
So it's not the be-all and end-all. So I want to wrap up and be respectful of people's time. So I just want to give a chance for any of the other panelists who have joined us today to say final few words. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your attention and your time and your questions today. Do please go to the UMA wiki, which is that tiny URL there, to find these slides that we presented, and also ultimately a recording. And get involved. We'd love to see you. If this helps solve some of your problems, we'd love to see you help make it a reality faster. And any humanitarians who join the call, we'll be starting our weekly telecon in just a moment. Thanks all. Bye-bye.